Dale, today we're going to talk more about two-column proofs, and we're going to sort of add an extra step. So far we have been proving triangles to be congruent. And so now we want to know, once we have triangles congruent, we want to be able to prove some future things. And we started this unit off by saying when we know triangles are congruent, and we know that the parts that correspond are also congruent. So we would say that corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. And so if we can prove that two triangles are congruent, then we can then show after that that any pair of corresponding parts that haven't been marked up already are also congruent, because if they're in congruent triangles and they correspond, especially based on the name of the triangles, then those parts are congruent. And so this is typically a reason why we can say things are congruent. And so rather than writing all of that, we usually will just shorten this to CPCTC. CPCTC, corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. And so we're going to prove these things similar to how we did before. We always will start with our given information, and we should put it on the picture and what that means, and then we're going to fill out the proof. And so you can see here, what we are trying to prove is not something about triangles, it's about angles. And so in this case too, I might like circle the thing I'm trying to prove. But let's start with the given information. I know that X is the midpoint of VZ, that is this big segment. If X is the midpoint, like we discussed before, that means that these pieces that X splits up should be congruent to each other, because if it's right in the middle, that means Vx and Xz should be the same length. We're also told that X is the midpoint of WY, so this one. So these two are congruent. And then there's something on here that we haven't been given, but we know is true because we've been looking at these now for several lessons. Vertical angles are always congruent. And so hopefully you can see here that we have side angle side. And so we are going to show that the triangles are congruent by side angle side. And then after we say they're congruent, we'll be able to prove that these two angles are congruent. So XVZ, that one up here, and XZY, that one over here. Once we prove these triangles are congruent, we're going to be allowed to say that those angles are congruent because they are corresponding angles. They're corresponding parts in two congruent triangles. They're congruent because we're going to prove they are. And so then we'll be able to say they're congruent. So let's get started on our proof. We always start with the given information. So I'm going to pause here and put my two pieces of given information in my statements column and then put their reason as, hey, it was given to us. So once we have the given information on there, now we can start documenting the things that we marked up. So the first thing we marked up was these little marks in orange, that Vx and Xz were congruent. So I'm going to write that. The reason I was allowed to do that was because of the definition of a midpoint. Since X was the midpoint, we know that those two pieces of that segment must be congruent. And then we went and marked up these two in red, Wx and Xy. And we have the same reason. X was the midpoint. So by definition, that midpoint makes two segments that are congruent. That does it for the given information, and then we went and followed that up with saying that these angles are congruent because they're vertical angles. So angle WXV is congruent to angle and that was because they are vertical angles. So see, we said we were going to prove these triangles congruent by side angle side. We have documented all of the things that we marked up that showed us we had side angle side. So we are now allowed to say that the triangles are congruent. And so I'm going to say triangle VXW is congruent to triangle ZXY. And that's by side angle side. And if you have questions about how we name or how I name those triangles, make sure you ask. I did start with my side here that had one marking, and so I'm going to start in my other triangle with the side name that has one marking. And of course, X is congruent in both triangles, so it has to be in the same spot in my name. So now we have shown that the two triangles are congruent. So now we are allowed to say that any pair of corresponding parts that aren't already marked up are congruent to each other because corresponding parts in congruent triangles are congruent. So I'm now allowed to say that that thing is true. XVW is congruent to XZW. Or I'm sorry, XZY. And we can just say CPCTC, CPCTC. And so this is just sort of an extension on what we did in the last lesson, just one step further. In the last lesson, we showed triangles were congruent, and that's what we wanted to do. And now we're taking that a step further and taking those congruent triangles that allow us to show that the other corresponding parts that we didn't already know were congruent are congruent now. So let's do another example together of that. I'm going to take my given information and put it on the picture. It is so important to draw these pictures and to mark them up so that you can see what's happening. You don't have to keep it in your head. You put it down on paper or on the desk, and it's so helpful. QS is congruent to TS. R is the midpoint of QT. So down here, QT is this bottom segment, and R is the midpoint. It might not look like it right now, but our given information is saying that it is. So if R is the midpoint, that means that these two segments are congruent. Trying to stay color-coded here. And so that's it for the given information, but there's something in this picture that we know is true, even though we're not told about it. We know that this segment is the same in both triangles because of the reflexive property, so we can mark that up as well. And I'm hoping you're seeing here that we have the side-side-side shortcut or pattern. And so we don't want to prove the triangles are congruent as our end goal, but we need to prove they're congruent so we can prove these two angles are congruent. So we are looking to show that RQS, this angle, and RTS, that one, we are trying to show that they're congruent. Well, if we show that the triangles are congruent, then we'll be allowed to say that those angles are congruent because of the corresponding parts of congruent triangles being congruent. So I'm going to pause here. I'm going to put my given information onto my proof, and you should do the same thing. So we've got the given information on here, and we always use our given information to put some markings on to the picture. So then we should document what we've marked up. So we mark up, we already marked up QS and TS, which we said. And then the midpoint told us that QR was congruent to TR. And that was by definition of midpoint. And then we were able to mark this middle piece because of the reflexive property, so we need to write that. So we're basically just saying that that side is congruent to itself. We call that the reflexive property. those three things that we marked up told us that we had side, side, side. And so now we can say that these triangles are congruent by side, side, side. And so the very last thing we want to do is say that these two angles are congruent. Well, because we have shown that the triangles are congruent, and those two angles correspond, Q and T correspond, we can say they're congruent. So you can write it like this. It's also okay to say angle Q is congruent to angle T, because there is only one angle Q and one angle T in these triangles, and we are going to use CPCTC. So as ever, this is a new idea for us. Even though we've done one lesson, it's still very new to us. The shortcuts and the patterns are still pretty new to us, not something we've done in classes before. So if you do have questions, please do make sure you ask for help. I'm going to give you a proof to fill in. So please copy down the given, the thing you want to prove, and the picture. And then I can slide down and I can give you the partially filled in proof so you can answer the questions. And there is a statement reason bank below it that you can use to guide you through this. So hopefully you've copied that stuff down. I'm going to zoom out a bit so you can see our bank. So you are going to be filling this in, trying to prove that segment AB is congruent to segment AD using what's left over down here. So some of these are already used. So put the correct answer in for each box, and then you will see the solution. If you need help while you're working through this, please do ask. So go ahead and check your answers here. If you got one or more of them wrong and you can't figure out why, please do ask so that one of us can explain it to you. And then when you're done with that, move on. I've got one more for you to do for practice where you need to fill in the blanks. The answers won't pop up, but if you get stuck, as always, ask for help. And you should first copy down this information so that you have it when I scroll down and all you can see is the two-column proof and the options. So copy this stuff down and then continue. And I should note that this symbol means parallel. We've seen that before, but it's been a while. So fill in these 5 blanks. Ask for help if you need it.